Hey there, I'm Jedediah Blackwood. I'm 82 years old, and I've been farming this land for over 60 years. Every morning when I wake up, my bones might creak a little louder than they used to, but my spirit is as strong as the oak trees that line the eastern boundary of my property. You might think an old man like me would be easy pickings for anyone looking to take advantage, but let me tell you something about us old farmers. We've weathered storms that would send most folks running for cover, and we've learned a thing or two about survival along the way. Like this video if you think family loyalty should go both ways, and comment what you'd do in my situation. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't just a story about farming or property or even revenge. It's about what happens when the very people you raised with your own two hands, the children you sacrificed everything for, turn around and show you their true colors. You see, my son Kevin decided this land, my legacy, was nothing more than a quick payday for him and his city friends. But what Kevin didn't know was that my late wife, Eleanor, God rest her soul, taught me more than just how to grow crops. She taught me how to plant seeds for the future in ways he could never imagine. Stick around because this story will blow your mind. The Blackwood Creek Farm sits on 500 acres of the most beautiful land you'll ever see in rural Missouri. It's been in my family since my grandfather bought it back in 1923, right after he came back from the Great War with a limp and a determination to build something that would last. The main house, a two-story farmhouse with white clapboard siding and green shutters, has stood through nearly a century of seasons, and every board, every nail, every stone in the foundation has a story to tell. When I was just 20 years old, I brought my bride Eleanor here, carrying her over that threshold while she laughed and told me I'd throw out my back before we even started our life together. That was 62 years ago. Not a day goes by that I don't think about her laugh, the way it would echo through these rooms like music. We raised 3 children in this house. Kevin, my eldest, then the twins, Mary and Martha. The girls, bless them, they understood what this place meant. Mary lives in California now, teaches school, and Martha's up in Minnesota with her husband running a small organic operation of their own. They visit when they can, call every Sunday, and never once have they looked at this farm and seen dollar signs instead of memories. But Kevin, well, Kevin was always different. Even as a boy, he had his eyes on the horizon, always talking about the big city, about making real money, about how farming was a dying way of life. Eleanor used to say he had ambition, and that wasn't a bad thing, but I could see something else in his eyes, a kind of hunger that good soil and honest work could never satisfy. He left for college at 18, studied business, and landed himself a job in Kansas City, selling insurance or investments or some such thing I never quite understood. He married Susan, a woman who looked at our farm like it was something scraped off her designer shoes, and they had 2 kids who barely knew what a chicken looked like outside of a grocery store freezer. For years, our relationship was cordial enough. Holiday visits, birthday cards, the occasional phone call where he'd tell me about his latest promotion, and I'd update him on the harvest. Eleanor always smoothed things over, always found a way to bridge the gap between Kevin's world and ours. She had a gift for that, for making people feel connected even when they were drifting apart. The farm itself is more than just land and buildings. It's a living thing that breathes with the seasons. We've got 200 acres of corn, another 150 in soybeans, 50 acres of pasture for the cattle, and the rest is woodland and the creek that gives the farm its name. The barn, built by my grandfather's own hands, still stands strong, painted red like tradition demands, housing the equipment that's kept this operation running through good years and bad. There's the machine shed where I've spent countless hours maintaining tractors and combines, teaching Kevin and the girls how to change oil and replace belts, though only the girls ever showed any real interest. The chicken coop out back provides fresh eggs every morning, and the vegetable garden that Eleanor planted our first spring here still produces enough to feed a small army. Every fence post, every furrow, every tree has been tended by these hands, and before mine, by my father's hands, and before his, by my grandfather's. This isn't just property, it's heritage, it's legacy. It's the physical manifestation of generations of hard work and sacrifice. Eleanor understood this in a way that I'm only now beginning to fully appreciate. She wasn't raised on a farm. She was a town girl, daughter of the local banker, educated and refined in ways that made some folks wonder what she saw in a rough-handed farmer like me. But she took to this life like she was born to it. And more than that, she brought her own kind of wisdom to it. Her father had taught her about contracts and legal matters, about the importance of documentation and proper procedures. I remember how she'd sit at the kitchen table with her reading glasses perched on her nose, going through every piece of paperwork that came our way, making sure everything was in order. She kept files on everything, receipts, contracts, correspondence, all organized in that old filing cabinet that still sits in the study. I used to tease her about it, calling her my little librarian, but she'd just smile and say that someday I'd thank her for being so careful. She was right about that, like she was right about so many things. The relationship between Kevin and me started to really deteriorate after Eleanor passed. It was cancer, the kind that starts quiet and moves fast, and we only had 6 months from diagnosis to the end. Those last weeks, Kevin came around more, but even then I could see him looking around the property with calculating eyes. While his mother was dying, he was adding up acres and estimating values. The day after the funeral, before the casseroles from the church ladies had even been finished, he pulled me aside and started talking about options for the future. He said I was too old to manage the farm alone, that it was too much work for one man, especially one in his 80s. He had a point about the work. It had gotten harder without Eleanor, not just the physical labor but the loneliness of it all. But what he was suggesting wasn't help. It was surrender. He wanted me to sell, to move into one of those assisted living places where they treat you like a child who can't be trusted with your own decisions. When I told him no, that I planned to die on this land just like Eleanor did, he got this look in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Something cold and calculating. Like I wasn't his father anymore, but just an obstacle in his path. The first real sign of trouble came about 3 months after Eleanor's passing. Kevin started calling more frequently, but not to check on my well-being. Every conversation somehow circled back to the farm's value, to how much money was just sitting here unutilized. He'd quote real estate prices, talk about development opportunities, about how farmland was being converted to subdivisions all over the county. He'd send me articles about farmers who'd sold out and retired as millionaires, living their golden years on golf courses in Florida. When I told him I had no interest in golf or Florida, he'd get frustrated, his voice taking on that tone he used to use as a teenager when he didn't get his way. Susan would sometimes get on the phone, too, her voice syrupy sweet but with an edge underneath, talking about how they worried about me all alone out here, how it wasn't safe for a man my age to be operating heavy machinery, how one accident could leave me helpless with no one around to help. They painted a picture of doom and disaster. But I could hear the greed underneath their concern, could feel them circling like vultures waiting for me to show weakness. I kept myself busy with the work, finding solace in the routine that had shaped my entire adult life. Every morning, I'd wake at 5, just like always, make my coffee in the same percolator Eleanor and I got as a wedding gift, and head out to check on the animals. The cattle knew me, would come to the fence when they saw me coming, and I'd talk to them like old friends. The chickens would cluster around my feet as I scattered their feed, and the barn cats would wind around my legs, purring for their breakfast. The fields needed tending, equipment needed maintaining, and there was always something that needed fixing or adjusting. The work kept my hands busy and my mind focused, but in the quiet moments, when I'd sit on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky the same colors Eleanor used to love, the loneliness would creep in. That's when Kevin's words would echo in my mind, making me wonder if maybe I was being stubborn, if maybe holding on to the farm was just an old man's foolishness. But then I'd remember Eleanor's words, spoken in those last days when the morphine made her honest in ways that cut straight to the bone. She'd held my hand, her grip still surprisingly strong, and made me promise to keep the farm in the family, but only for those who understood its true value. She said Kevin had lost his way, that the city had changed him, made him forget where he came from. She worried about what would happen when I was gone, whether Kevin would honor our legacy or sell it to the highest bidder. She made me promise to be smart, to protect what we'd built, even if it meant protecting it from our own son. At the time, I'd thought it was the medication talking, the fear that comes when you know your time is running out. But as Kevin's calls became more insistent, more demanding, I began to understand what she had seen that I'd been too blind to notice. The spring planting season was when things started to escalate. Kevin showed up unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, but he wasn't alone. He had a man with him, tall and slick in a suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing sunglasses even though it was cloudy. Kevin introduced him as Mr. Davidson, a developer from Kansas City who specialized in rural transformation projects. They didn't even ask to come in for coffee, just started walking my land like they already owned it, pointing at where houses could go, where roads could be cut, talking about utility access and lot sizes. I followed them, my bad knee protesting with every step, listening to them discuss destroying everything Eleanor and I had built like they were planning a picnic. Davidson kept talking about maximizing value and development potential, while Kevin nodded along, occasionally glancing at me with this mixture of excitement and impatience. When they finally finished their tour and came back to the house, Davidson spread out papers on the hood of his Mercedes, started quoting numbers that made my head spin. $5 million, he said, like that should mean something to me. $5 million for land that had been bought with my grandfather's saved army pay, that had been watered with 4 generations of sweat and tears. Kevin's eyes lit up when he heard the number, and I could practically see him calculating his inheritance in his head. Davidson said they could close within 60 days, that I could be relaxing in a nice condo somewhere before summer hit full swing. Kevin jumped in then, painting a picture of how good life could be without the burden of the farm, how I could travel, see the world, enjoy my remaining years instead of working myself to death. He said it with such conviction, like he actually believed he was doing me a favor, like taking away everything I loved was an act of kindness. I told them no. It wasn't a maybe or a let me think about it. It was a flat, firm no. The farm wasn't for sale, not then, not ever. I said it calmly, clearly, the way Eleanor had taught me to speak when I meant business. Davidson looked annoyed but not surprised. I imagine he'd dealt with stubborn old farmers before. He gathered his papers, gave Kevin a look that seemed to say, "You said this would be easy," and headed back to his Mercedes. But Kevin didn't leave with him. Instead, he followed me into the house, his face red with embarrassment and anger. He started in on me before I could even get my boots off, saying I was being unreasonable, that I was throwing away an opportunity that would never come again. His voice got louder with each word, and I could see Susan's influence in the way he argued, the way he tried to make me feel guilty for not giving him what he wanted. The argument that followed was the worst we'd ever had. Kevin accused me of being senile, of being too stubborn to see reality, of caring more about dirt than my own family. He said Eleanor would be ashamed of me for being so selfish, and that's when I snapped. I told him Eleanor would be ashamed of him for what he'd become, for valuing money over family, for seeing the farm as nothing more than a commodity to be sold. I told him about his mother's last wishes, about her fears that he'd lost his way, and I could see each word hit him like a physical blow. But instead of softening him, it made him harder, meaner. He said Eleanor was dying when she said those things, that she wasn't thinking clearly, that I was using a dead woman's confused words to justify my own stubbornness. The disrespect in his voice when he talked about his mother, the woman who'd given him life and loved him despite his faults, was more than I could bear. I told him to leave, to get out of my house and not come back until he could show proper respect for his mother's memory and his family's heritage. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard that Eleanor's collection of decorative plates rattled on the wall. I thought that would be the end of it, that he'd cool down and maybe we could find a way to talk about it like civilized people. But I underestimated how far Kevin had already gone in his mind, how much he'd already counted on that money, maybe even promised it to others. Susan called that evening, and her approach was different, but no less manipulative. She spoke in that fake concerned voice, saying they were worried about my mental state, that my reaction had been troubling and not like the father-in-law she knew. She suggested maybe I should see a doctor, get evaluated, make sure everything was okay upstairs. The threat was subtle but clear. Play ball or they'd start questioning my competency. I hung up on her, something I'd never done before, but I couldn't stand listening to her pretend to care when all she wanted was her payday. The next few weeks were a campaign of pressure and intimidation. Kevin called Adult Protective Services, claiming he was concerned about my ability to care for myself. A social worker came out, a nice young woman who seemed embarrassed to be there, and after talking to me for an hour and seeing that I was perfectly capable of managing my affairs, she left with an apology for taking up my time. Then came the code enforcement officer, saying they'd received complaints about various violations on the property. He found nothing substantial, just suggested I might want to paint the barn and fix a loose board on the chicken coop. The tax assessor showed up next, saying they needed to reevaluate the property value. Each visit was a message from Kevin. He wasn't giving up, and he was willing to use every tool at his disposal to force my hand. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. Kevin had always been the one who organized family gatherings, and with him poisoning the well, the invitations stopped coming. My grandchildren, Kevin's kids, stopped calling. Susan made sure of that, I'm certain. The only bright spot was Sarah, my granddaughter from Mary out in California. She was in college, studying agricultural science of all things, and she called me one evening just to check in. She said she'd heard from her cousins that there was some drama about the farm, and she wanted to hear my side. I told her everything, and she listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that showed she understood more than just the surface of the situation. She told me about a paper she was writing about family farms and their importance to American heritage, and asked if she could interview me for it. Those conversations with Sarah became a lifeline, reminding me that not all of the younger generation had lost touch with what really mattered. The weather that spring was unpredictable, with late freezes threatening the early crops and then sudden heat waves that stressed everything. I worked harder than I had in years, trying to prove to myself as much as anyone else that I could still manage the farm. But my body was betraying me in small ways. My knee would give out at unexpected moments, my back would seize up after too many hours on the tractor, and there were mornings when my arthritis made it hard to even hold a coffee cup. I started to wonder if maybe Kevin had a point, if maybe I was being foolish trying to hold on to something that was becoming too much for me. But then I'd walk through the fields in the evening, seeing the green shoots pushing through the soil, hearing the cattle lowing in the pasture, feeling the connection to the land that ran deeper than blood, and I knew I couldn't give it up. This farm wasn't just my home, it was my identity, my purpose, my connection to everyone who had come before and everyone who would come after. It was a Tuesday in late May when everything came to a head. I'd been out checking the corn, which was coming along nicely despite the weather challenges, when I saw Kevin's BMW pulling up the drive. He wasn't alone. Susan was with him, and they had papers in their hands. I met them on the porch, not inviting them in, and Kevin started talking immediately. He said they'd been to see a lawyer, that they were prepared to file for conservatorship if I didn't agree to sell. He had a contract with him, Davidson's offer in writing, and all I had to do was sign. Susan chimed in, talking about how this was for my own good, how they just wanted to make sure I was taken care of, how the money from the sale would ensure I had the best care for the rest of my life. They tag-teamed me, Kevin with his threats and Susan with her false concern, trying to wear me down like water on stone. I stood my ground, told them again that the farm wasn't for sale, that I would die before I let them turn it into a subdivision. That's when Kevin lost it completely. His face turned red, then purple, and he started screaming about how I was a selfish old fool, how I was destroying his future, his children's future, all for some misguided attachment to worthless land. He grabbed the porch railing, shaking it as he yelled, and I could see Susan trying to calm him down, but he was beyond reason. He said Eleanor would be disgusted with me, that I was dishonoring her memory by being so stubborn. That was the last straw for me. I told him he had no right to speak his mother's name, not when he was spitting on everything she valued. I told him to get off my property and never come back, that he was no son of mine if he could stand there and try to steal his inheritance before I was even in the ground. What happened next shocked even Susan. Kevin grabbed the small garden shovel that was leaning against the porch post, the one I used for transplanting Eleanor's flowers, and swung it at me. I tried to step back, but my bad knee buckled, and I went down hard on the porch boards. The shovel caught me on the shin, sending pain shooting up my leg like fire. Kevin stood over me, breathing hard, still holding the shovel, and for a moment I thought he might hit me again. Susan was screaming at him to stop, pulling at his arm, and he seemed to come back to himself. He dropped the shovel, but instead of helping me up or apologizing, he leaned down and said, "Sign the papers, old man. or next time it'll be worse." Then he turned and walked back to his car, Susan trailing behind him, leaving me sprawled on my own porch with my leg bleeding and my heart breaking. I managed to get myself inside and cleaned up the wound, which wasn't as bad as it felt, but left a nasty bruise that covered most of my shin. I sat in Eleanor's chair that night, the one by the window where she used to do her needlework, and I talked to her like she was still there. I told her about what Kevin had done, about how our son had raised his hand to me, and I asked her what I should do. The house was quiet except for the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, but somehow I felt her presence, felt her strength flowing into me. I remembered something she'd said near the end when the pain was bad and the medication made her ramble. She'd gripped my hand and said, "The papers, Jed, remember the papers." I made sure everything was proper. The files in the cabinet, the lockbox in the closet, everything we need is there. I thought it was just the morphine talking, but sitting there in her chair with my leg throbbing and my son's betrayal fresh in my mind, I wondered if maybe she'd been trying to tell me something important. The next morning, I could barely walk. The bruise had spread and turned an ugly purple black, and my knee was swollen from the fall. But I had work to do, animals to feed, and I wasn't going to let Kevin's assault stop me from taking care of my responsibilities. I wrapped my leg, took some aspirin, and headed out to do my chores. The cattle seemed to sense something was wrong, gathering at the fence and watching me with their big brown eyes as I limped through my routine. The chickens were less sympathetic, pecking around my feet impatiently as I scattered their feed. By noon, I was exhausted and in more pain than I wanted to admit. I made it back to the house and collapsed in my recliner, wondering how many more days like this I could take. That's when the phone calls started. First, it was Susan's mother, a woman I'd met maybe 3 times in 20 years, calling to tell me how disappointed she was in my behavior, how I was tearing the family apart with my selfishness. Then it was Kevin's business partner, someone I'd never even heard of, calling to explain the financial benefits of the development deal and how foolish I was to turn it down. Even the pastor from Kevin and Susan's church called, though at least he seemed genuinely concerned rather than just trying to pressure me. Each call was another weight in my shoulders, another voice telling me I was wrong, that I was the problem, that I should just give in and make everyone's life easier. But I noticed something interesting. Not one of them mentioned Kevin hitting me with the shovel. Either he hadn't told them that part, or they didn't care. Sarah called that evening and I could hear the worry in her voice. She'd tried to reach her cousins to wish them happy birthday. Apparently, it was the twins' birthday, Kevin's kids, and they'd told her about the family drama, though their version painted me as a senile old man refusing to accept reality. Sarah didn't buy it, knew me too well to believe I'd lost my mind, and she asked me directly what had really happened. I told her everything, including the assault, and I could hear her sharp intake of breath over the phone. She asked if I'd called the police, if I'd seen a doctor, and I had to admit I'd done neither. She got quiet for a moment, then said she was coming to visit. She had a break coming up from school, and she wanted to see the farm, to help out if she could. I tried to tell her not to bother, that I could handle things, but she insisted in that way that reminded me so much of Eleanor, gentle but absolutely immovable once she'd made up her mind. The next few days were a blur of pain and determination. My leg got worse before it got better, turning colors I didn't know bruises could turn, and the simple act of walking became a challenge. But the farm didn't care about my injuries, and neither did I. The corn needed checking, The cattle needed feeding, and the equipment needed maintaining. I worked through the pain, using it as fuel for my anger at Kevin, at what he'd become, at what he was willing to do for money. Every step was a reminder of his betrayal, every twinge a testament to how far he'd fallen from the boy I'd raised. But it also strengthened my resolve. If Kevin was willing to assault his own father for this land, then I sure as hell wasn't going to hand it over to him. It was while I was going through Eleanor's files, looking for the insurance papers to see if they covered assault by family members, a bitter thought that would have made Eleanor weep, that I found the first hint of what she'd been trying to tell me. There was a folder I'd never seen before, labeled Property Documentation Important in Eleanor's neat handwriting. Inside were copies of deeds, surveys, and legal documents going back to when my grandfather had first bought the land. But there was also something else, something that made me sit down hard in Eleanor's desk chair. It was a letter from a lawyer, dated just a month before Eleanor's diagnosis, discussing something called a perpetual agricultural use covenant that was attached to our property deed. The letter was full of legal language that made my head spin, but the gist seemed to be that there were restrictions on how the land could be used, restrictions that went back to the original sale in 1923. I spent the rest of that day going through every piece of paper in that filing cabinet, finding more references to this covenant, more hints that Eleanor had been researching something important about our property rights. There were printed emails with a lawyer in Jefferson City, copies of historical documents from the county recorder's office, and notes in Eleanor's handwriting that I couldn't quite decipher. She'd been building a case for something, preparing for something, and I wished desperately that she was here to explain it all to me. But she wasn't, and I was going to have to figure it out on my own. As I sat there surrounded by papers, my leg throbbing and my head aching from trying to understand legal terminology, I thought about what people mean when they talk about loyalty, about family, about the bonds that are supposed to hold us together through good times and bad. You know, sitting here thinking about it all, I wonder what you folks would do in my situation. When the people you raised, the children you sacrificed everything for, turn on you like hungry wolves, what's the right response? Is it loyalty to keep giving them chances, or is loyalty to yourself and your departed spouse more important? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, because this story is far from over, and the lessons I learned might help someone else facing similar betrayal. The thing about farming is that you learn patience. You plant seeds and wait for them to grow. You tend your crops through seasons of plenty and seasons of drought, and you understand that sometimes the harvest you get isn't the one you expected. Kevin thought he was dealing with a weak old man, someone he could bully into submission with threats and violence. But what he didn't understand was that Eleanor and I had been preparing for storms our whole lives, and she'd made sure that even after she was gone, the farm would be protected from those who would destroy it for profit. The lockbox Eleanor had mentioned was in the back of our bedroom closet, behind boxes of her clothes that I hadn't been able to bring myself to donate yet. It was a small, fireproof safe that I'd forgotten we even owned, and the combination was our wedding date. Of course it was. Inside, along with our marriage certificate and other important documents, was another folder, this one labeled "For Jed, open only if needed" in Eleanor's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, and what I found inside changed everything. There were more legal documents, but these were different. These were weapons, carefully prepared and waiting to be deployed. Eleanor had known this day would come, had seen Kevin's greed growing like a cancer, and she'd made sure I'd have everything I needed to protect our legacy. The first document was a copy of the original deed from 1923, but this one had been highlighted and annotated by Eleanor. She'd marked a section I'd never paid attention to before, something called a reverter clause that was tied to the agricultural covenant. According to her notes, if the land was ever used for non-agricultural purposes or sold for development, ownership wouldn't go to the buyer. It would automatically revert to the local 4-H organization to be used as an educational farm. The clause had been put in place by the original owner, a man named Samuel Morrison, who'd been one of the founding members of the county's agricultural society. He'd wanted to ensure that this land would always be used for farming, would always serve as a reminder of the area's agricultural heritage. It was ironclad, Eleanor had written, tested in court twice in the 1960s when other properties with similar clauses had been challenged, and both times the clause had been upheld. The second document was even more interesting. It was a will, but not Eleanor's final will. This was an earlier version, dated 5 years before her death, and it included provisions I'd never seen before. In this version, she'd set up a trust for the farm, with specific instructions about how it could be managed and who could inherit it. The trust required that any heir who wanted to claim ownership had to work the farm for at least 5 consecutive years, had to live on the property, and had to demonstrate a commitment to maintaining its agricultural use. It was brilliant, really. A way to ensure that only someone who truly valued the farm for what it was, not what it could be sold for, would ever own it. There was a note attached explaining why she'd eventually simplified her will, hoping that Kevin would come to his senses. But she'd kept this version as a backup plan, knowing I might need it someday. The third item in the folder wasn't a legal document, but a letter from Eleanor to me. I had to stop reading several times because my eyes kept filling with tears, making it hard to see her neat handwriting. She wrote about her love for me, for the farm, for the life we'd built together. She wrote about her fears for Kevin, how she'd watched him change over the years, becoming someone she barely recognized. She apologized for not being there to help me through what she knew was coming, but she assured me that she'd done everything she could to protect me and the farm. She told me about the lawyers she'd consulted, the research she'd done, the preparations she'd made. She even mentioned Sarah specifically, saying she saw something special in her, a connection to the land that skipped a generation. The letter ended with her telling me to be strong, to not let grief or loneliness cloud my judgment, and to remember that sometimes the greatest act of love is saying no to those who would destroy what you've built. I sat on our bed holding that letter until the sun went down, feeling Eleanor's presence so strongly it was like she was sitting right beside me. The pain in my leg seemed insignificant compared to the pain in my heart, but alongside that pain was something else: determination. Eleanor had given me the tools I needed. Now I just had to figure out how to use them. I spent the next day on the phone with lawyers, trying to find one who understood rural property law and wasn't connected to Kevin or his circle of influence. It took 6 calls before I found the right one. A young woman named Jennifer Martinez who'd grown up on a farm herself and had made a career out of helping family farms stay in the family. She listened to my story, asked to see the documents Eleanor had collected, and by the end of our conversation, she was as fired up as I was. Jennifer came out to the farm 2 days later, and we spent hours going through everything. She was impressed by Eleanor's thoroughness, said my wife had built an airtight case without even having a law degree. The perpetual agricultural use covenant was indeed enforceable, she confirmed, and any attempt to develop the land would trigger the reverter clause immediately. Moreover, Kevin's assault on me gave us additional leverage. We could file criminal charges, seek a restraining order, and use his violent behavior as evidence that he shouldn't have any claim to the property. Jennifer also suggested we could revive Eleanor's trust idea, creating an ironclad succession plan that would protect the farm for generations to come. She warned me that things might get ugly, that Kevin would likely fight back with everything he had, but I told her I was ready for war if that's what it took to honor Eleanor's wishes and protect our legacy. Sarah arrived 3 days after the assault, driving straight through from California in her beat-up Honda Civic. When she saw the bruise on my leg, which had spread down to my ankle and up to my knee by then, she insisted on taking me to the hospital. The doctor confirmed what I already knew. Nothing was broken, but the soft tissue damage was significant. He prescribed pain medication and suggested I stay off my feet for at least a week, which we both knew wasn't going to happen. Sarah took photos of everything, documenting the injury from every angle, and made me file a police report. The officer who came out to take my statement seemed uncomfortable with the family drama aspect of it all, but he did his job, took down the information, and said a detective would follow up. Having Sarah at the farm was like having a piece of Eleanor back. She threw herself into the work with an enthusiasm that reminded me of myself at her age, asking questions about everything from soil composition to crop rotation. She helped me with the daily chores, learning quickly and never complaining about the early mornings or the physical labor. In the evenings, we'd sit on the porch and I'd tell her stories about the farm's history, about her grandmother, about the way things used to be. She told me about her studies, about how she wanted to work in agricultural preservation, helping family farms adapt to modern challenges while maintaining their traditional values. She said the paper she was writing had evolved into her thesis project, and she wanted to use our farm as a case study if I was okay with it. I told her she could write whatever she wanted as long as it was the truth. It was Sarah who suggested we start documenting everything on video. She said it would be useful for legal purposes, but also for posterity, to have a record of what really happened. So she set up her phone and interviewed me, getting me to tell the whole story from the beginning. I showed her the bruise, the documents Eleanor had left, the land that Kevin wanted to destroy. She interviewed Jennifer, too, getting her legal perspective on camera. She even drove out to talk to some of the neighbors, old-timers who'd known our family for generations and who were horrified by what Kevin had done. Old Pete Henderson, whose farm bordered ours to the south, got particularly heated, saying Kevin was a disgrace to his family name and that Eleanor would be rolling in her grave if she knew what her son had become. The detective finally showed up a week after the assault, and by then Sarah had compiled a file that would make any prosecutor salivate. Photos, videos, witness statements, documentation of Kevin's escalating behavior. She'd organized it all with the same meticulous attention to detail that Eleanor had always shown. The detective seemed surprised by how prepared we were, probably expecting to find a confused old man with a grudge against his son. Instead, he found a clear case of assault, elder abuse, and attempted financial exploitation. He took our evidence, said he'd be in touch, and warned me that pressing charges against my own son would likely destroy any chance of reconciliation. I told him that Kevin had destroyed that chance when he raised that shovel against me, and maybe even before that, when he'd decided that money was more important than family. Word about the police investigation spread quickly through our small community. Kevin called me screaming, saying I'd ruined his reputation, that his kids were being teased at school, that Susan's family was mortified. He threatened to sue me for defamation, for emotional distress, for anything his lawyer could think of. I didn't respond, just let him rant until he wore himself out and hung up. Susan called next, trying a different approach, crying about how this was tearing their family apart, how the kids needed their grandfather, how we could work this out if I'd just drop the charges. I told her that Kevin was the one who'd torn the family apart when he'd chosen violence over respect, and that the kids were welcome at the farm any time, but their father was not. Jennifer had been busy too, filing paperwork with the county to officially document the agricultural covenant and make sure any potential buyers would be aware of the restrictions on the land. She also started the process of setting up the trust Eleanor had envisioned, with Sarah as the primary beneficiary if she completed the requirements of working the farm for 5 years. It was a bold move, essentially disinheriting Kevin completely, but it felt right. Sarah had shown more love and respect for the farm in 1 week than Kevin had in his entire adult life. When I told Sarah about the trust, she cried, saying she didn't want to come between me and Kevin. I told her she wasn't coming between anything. Kevin had removed himself from the family when he'd decided to attack his own father for money. The response from the extended family was mixed. Mary, out in California, was horrified by what Kevin had done and fully supported my decision to press charges. She said she'd suspected something was off when Kevin had been pushing so hard for me to sell, but she never imagined he'd resort to violence. Martha, up in Minnesota, was more conflicted. She understood my position, but worried about the long-term impact on the family, especially on Kevin's kids. She tried to play peacemaker, suggesting family counseling or mediation, but I told her it was too late for that. You can't mediate assault, and you can't counsel away greed that runs so deep it turns a son against his father. The farm work continued despite all the drama. Spring was giving way to early summer, and there was so much to do. The corn was knee-high by the 4th of July, just like the old saying promised, and the soybeans were coming along nicely. Sarah and I worked side by side, her young energy complementing my experience, and for the first time since Eleanor died, I felt hopeful about the farm's future. She had ideas about diversifying our crops, adding organic vegetables for the local farmers market, maybe even starting a small agritourism operation to help educate people about farming. She saw the farm not as a burden or a gold mine, but as a living piece of history that needed to be preserved and shared. One evening, as we were sitting on the porch watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance, Sarah asked me about forgiveness. She wanted to know if I could ever forgive Kevin for what he'd done, if there was any way back from this. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I told her that forgiveness wasn't the same as forgetting, and it certainly wasn't the same as enabling. I could maybe, someday, forgive Kevin for the assault. People do terrible things when they're desperate or angry. But what I couldn't forgive was the disrespect, not just to me but to his mother's memory, to the generations who'd worked this land before us, to the very idea that some things are more valuable than money. That kind of fundamental disconnect, that inability to see value beyond dollar signs, that was something that couldn't be fixed with an apology or even genuine remorse. The legal process moved slowly but steadily forward. Kevin was formally charged with assault and elder abuse, and a restraining order was put in place. He was forbidden from coming within 500 feet of me or the farm, which effectively meant he couldn't even drive by on the main road without violating the order. His lawyer tried to get the charges reduced or dismissed, arguing that it was a family dispute that had gotten out of hand. But the prosecutor, a young woman who'd grown up on a dairy farm 2 counties over, wasn't having it. She said elder abuse was elder abuse, regardless of family relationships, and that Kevin's attempt to financially exploit me made the assault even more serious. Meanwhile, Jennifer was working on the trust documents, making sure everything was airtight. She included provisions that would protect the farm not just from development, but from any form of non-agricultural use. She also added language that would prevent any heir from selling the farm for 50 years after inheriting it, ensuring that whoever took over would be committed for the long haul. It was exactly what Eleanor would have wanted, a legal framework that embodied her values and protected the land she'd loved so much. When I signed the papers, I felt like I was finally fulfilling the promise I'd made to her in those final days. The Davidson Development Company, apparently unaware of the legal restrictions on the land, sent another representative out to make an offer. This one was younger, cockier, and clearly thought he could charm or intimidate me into selling. Sarah was with me when he arrived, and she handled him beautifully, calmly explaining the perpetual agricultural use covenant and the reverter clause while he stood there with his mouth hanging open. He tried to argue that such restrictions couldn't possibly be legal, that they violated modern property rights, but Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him the case law supporting such covenants. He left in a huff, muttering about backward rural communities and outdated laws, but we never heard from Davidson Development again. As summer progressed, the community rallied around me in ways I hadn't expected. Neighbors stopped by to help with projects that required more hands than Sarah and I could provide. The church ladies brought casseroles and baked goods, saying they were just checking in, but really making sure I was eating properly. Even the young families in town, people I barely knew, would wave and honk when they drove by, showing their support. It seemed that Kevin's behavior had offended the community's sense of right and wrong, and they were making it clear whose side they were on. This was still a place where respecting your elders meant something, where family land was sacred, and where raising your hand to your father was unforgivable. Kevin made one last attempt to get the farm before the criminal case went to trial. His lawyer reached out to Jennifer with a proposal. Kevin would plead guilty to a lesser charge and accept the restraining order if I would agree to leave him something in my will. Not the farm, necessarily, but some portion of its value. Jennifer brought the offer to me, and I could see she expected me to at least consider it. But I didn't need to think about it. Kevin had made his choice when he'd swung that shovel, when he'd chosen violence over respect, greed over family. He'd get nothing from me, not a single acre, not a single dollar from the farm's value. The farm would go to someone who understood its true worth, someone who would work it and love it and protect it for future generations. Sarah had to go back to California to finish her summer classes, but she promised to return as soon as she could. Before she left, we walked the entire property together, all 500 acres, while I told her everything I knew about each section. This field had been where my grandfather had planted his first crop after coming back from the war. That grove of trees was where Eleanor and I had gotten married, under the big oak that had been struck by lightning the year before she died. The creek where Kevin had learned to fish back when he still found joy in simple things. The hill where we'd buried 3 generations of farm dogs each one marked with a small stone Eleanor had painted with their names. Every inch of this land had a story, and I wanted Sarah to know them all. The morning Sarah left, Kevin violated the restraining order. He didn't come onto the property, but he parked just beyond the boundary and sat there in his BMW, watching the house. I called the police and they arrested him, adding another charge to his growing list. Susan bailed him out that evening, but the damage was done. The judge revoked his bail for the assault charge, saying he'd proven he couldn't be trusted to follow court orders. Kevin spent the next 2 weeks in county jail before his lawyer could get a new bail hearing. Those 2 weeks changed him, or at least changed his tactics. When he got out, he didn't try to contact me again, didn't violate the restraining order, didn't make any more threats. Maybe he'd finally realized that he'd lost, or maybe he was just biding his time, waiting for another opportunity. The corn harvest that year was the best we'd had in a decade. The weather cooperated perfectly, with just enough rain through the growing season and then dry conditions for harvest. Sarah came back to help, taking a semester off from school to work the farm and learn the business side of the operation. We worked together like we'd been doing it for years, her operating the combine while I drove the grain truck, then switching off when one of us got tired. The neighbors commented on how good it was to see the farm thriving again, to see a young person taking an interest in continuing the tradition. Pete Henderson said Eleanor would be proud, and I knew he was right. The trial was set for November, after the harvest was complete. Jennifer had prepared a solid case, and the prosecutor was confident we'd get a conviction. Kevin's lawyer was pushing for a plea deal, but the prosecutor wasn't offering anything that didn't include jail time and a permanent restraining order. Kevin was facing the possibility of spending a year or more in prison, losing his professional licenses, and having a felony conviction on his record. All for a piece of land he'd never loved, never understood, never valued for what it truly was. The irony wasn't lost on me. And trying to steal the farm, he'd lost everything that actually mattered. As I write this, sitting in Eleanor's chair looking out at the fields we tended together for so many years, I can't help but reflect on what family really means. Is it blood? Is it obligation? Or is it something deeper, a shared understanding of what's important, a mutual respect that transcends generational differences? Kevin is my son, will always be my son, but he stopped being family the day he raised that shovel against me. Sarah, on the other hand, has shown herself to be the true heir to this land, not just through blood, but through her understanding of its value, her respect for its history, and her vision for its future. The farm will endure, protected by the legal framework Eleanor so carefully constructed and tended by someone who sees it as more than just acreage and crop yields. The perpetual agricultural use covenant ensures that no developer will ever turn these fields into suburban sprawl, and the trust ensures that only someone willing to work the land will ever own it. It's a fitting legacy for Eleanor, a woman who understood that some things are worth protecting, even from your own family, especially from your own family when they've lost their way. The November wind was cutting through the courthouse windows that morning, rattling them in their frames like it was trying to get inside to witness what was about to unfold. I sat in Jennifer's office, going over my testimony one more time, my hands steady despite everything that had led to this moment. Sarah was there too, having driven all night from California to be present for the trial, and her presence gave me strength I didn't know I needed. She'd brought a box of Eleanor's favorite tea, the chamomile blend she used to drink when she needed to calm her nerves, and we sipped it together while Jennifer walked us through what to expect. The prosecutor had warned us that Kevin's lawyer would try to paint me as a senile old man who'd misunderstood a simple family disagreement. But Jennifer had prepared us for that angle. We had evidence, documentation, photographs, and witness statements that told a very different story. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more intimate, which somehow made everything feel more personal and painful. Kevin was already there when we walked in, sitting at the defendant's table in a suit I'd never seen before, probably bought specifically to make him look respectable and remorseful. He'd lost weight during his 2 weeks in jail, and there were dark circles under his eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Susan sat in the row behind him, wearing a conservative dress and a cross necklace I'd never seen her wear before. Clearly, they were going for the good Christian family angle. Kevin's lawyer, a slick-looking man named Richardson who'd driven up from Kansas City, was shuffling papers and whispering urgently to Kevin, probably last-minute coaching on how to appear sympathetic. The judge, Honorable Patricia Thornton, was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd grown up on a dairy farm over in the next county. Jennifer had said this was good for us. Judge Thornton understood the value of family land and had little patience for those who would exploit their elderly parents. She called the court to order with a sharp rap of her gavel, and the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos, stood to present the state's case. Maria was young but fierce, and she'd told me she'd taken this case personally because her own grandfather had been manipulated by a greedy relative in his final years. She laid out the facts methodically: the escalating pressure to sell, the threats, the physical assault, the violation of the restraining order. She painted a picture of a son so consumed by greed that he'd attacked his own father for refusing to sell the family farm. When she called me to testify, I walked to the witness stand slowly but steadily, making sure the jury could see that while I might be old, I was far from feeble. Maria started with easy questions: my name, how long I'd lived on the farm, my relationship with Kevin. Then she moved into the harder territory, asking me to describe the assault. I told the story simply, without embellishment, just the facts of what happened that day on my porch. When she asked me to show the jury the photographs of my injury, I could see several of them wince at the vivid purple-black bruise that had covered most of my shin. One woman in the front row was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, and an older man was shaking his head in disgust. Richardson's cross-examination was exactly what Jennifer had prepared me for. He tried to suggest that I'd misunderstood Kevin's intentions, that the contact with the shovel had been accidental, that Kevin had just been trying to help me understand the financial benefits of selling. He asked about my age, my health, whether I'd been taking any medication that might affect my memory or perception. I answered each question calmly, clearly, remembering Jennifer's advice to stick to simple yes or no answers when possible and not to let him bait me into an argument. When he suggested that maybe I'd fallen and blamed Kevin to get attention, I simply said, "No, sir, I know the difference between falling and being struck with a shovel." The jury seemed to appreciate my straightforward responses. Sarah's testimony was powerful in a different way. As a family member who'd witnessed the aftermath, she could speak to both the physical and emotional damage Kevin had caused. She described finding me with the injury, taking me to the hospital, helping me document everything. She also testified about the family dynamics, how Kevin had always viewed the farm as a burden, while she and her sister had understood its true value. When Richardson tried to dismiss her as a biased witness, hoping to inherit the farm herself, She calmly explained that she was already named in the trust, but only if she worked the land for 5 years. A commitment she was happy to make because she loved the farm, not because she wanted to sell it. The most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. Pete Henderson, my neighbor, who'd observed Kevin's behavior over the years and had actually witnessed him violating the restraining order. Pete, dressed in his best overalls and a clean flannel shirt, told the jury about seeing Kevin parked at the property line, watching the house like a wolf watching a hen house. He also testified about conversations he'd overheard at the local diner where Kevin had been bragging about the money he'd make once he got control of the farm. Pete's testimony carried weight because he had no stake in the outcome. He was just a neighbor who'd been offended by Kevin's disrespect for his father and the family legacy. When it came time for the defense to present their case, Richardson called Kevin to testify. My son took the stand wearing an expression of practiced remorse, and Richardson walked him through a version of events that bore little resemblance to reality. In Kevin's telling, he'd been a concerned son trying to help his aging father make the best decision for his future. The shovel incident had been a misunderstanding. He'd picked it up to move it out of the way and accidentally made contact with my leg when I'd stumbled. He claimed he'd never meant to hurt me, that he loved me and only wanted what was best for the family. It was a performance worthy of a daytime soap opera, complete with strategic pauses and a trembling voice when he talked about how much he missed his mother. But Maria Santos destroyed his testimony on cross-examination. She produced the voicemails Kevin had left, playing them for the jury. His voice, full of rage, calling me senile, threatening to have me declared incompetent, saying I'd regret not taking the deal. She showed the emails he'd sent to Davidson Development, promising he could deliver the farm and discussing his plans to spend his share of the profits. She presented bank records showing he was deeply in debt, behind on his mortgage, maxed out on credit cards, clearly desperate for money. By the time she was done, Kevin's image as a concerned son was in tatters, replaced by the reality of a greedy, desperate man who'd do anything for a payday. Susan testified briefly, trying to support Kevin's version of events, but her testimony felt rehearsed and unconvincing. When Maria asked her about the family's financial situation, she tried to claim they were doing fine, but the prosecutor produced evidence of liens on their house, past due notices, and Kevin's gambling debts that Susan probably didn't even know about. The look of shock on Susan's face when she learned about the gambling was genuine, and I could see her glancing at Kevin with a mixture of anger and betrayal. It seemed she'd been kept in the dark about just how desperate their situation was. The defense's final witness was supposed to be a character witness for Kevin, his business partner who would testify to his good character and work ethic. But the man never showed up, and Richardson was forced to rest his case without him. Later, Jennifer heard through the legal grapevine that the partner had backed out after learning the full details of the case, not wanting to perjure himself for someone who'd assault his own father. It was another nail in Kevin's coffin, the absence speaking louder than any testimony could have. In closing arguments, Maria Santos was brilliant. She reminded the jury that elder abuse wasn't just about physical violence. It was about the violation of trust, the exploitation of vulnerability, the destruction of family bonds for financial gain. She pointed out that Kevin had shown no genuine remorse, only regret at being caught. She asked them to consider what message it would send if someone could assault their elderly parent and face no consequences just because they were family. She ended by saying that justice meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and that's exactly what the law was designed to do. Richardson's closing was an appeal to sympathy, asking the jury to consider the pressures Kevin had been under, the stress of financial problems, the grief of losing his mother. He suggested that prison time would be excessive for what was essentially a family dispute that had gotten out of hand. He asked them to consider Kevin's children, who would suffer if their father went to prison. It was emotional manipulation at its finest. But I could see the jury wasn't buying it. They'd heard the evidence, seen the photographs, listened to the voicemails. They knew what Kevin had done and why he'd done it. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they filed back in, I could tell from their expressions what the verdict would be. The foreman, a middle-aged woman who ran a small farm supply store in town, stood and read the verdict in a clear, strong voice. Guilty of assault in the second degree, guilty of elder abuse, guilty of violating a restraining order. Kevin's face went white, and Susan let out a sob. I felt no satisfaction, no joy, just a deep sadness that it had come to this. This was my son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, to throw a baseball, to drive a tractor. But that boy was gone, had been gone for years, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Judge Thornton scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, allowing time for a pre-sentencing investigation and victim impact statements. Jennifer said Kevin was facing up to 5 years in prison, though she expected he'd get less as a first-time offender. The restraining order would become permanent, and he'd likely have to pay restitution for my medical expenses and legal fees. His career in financial services was over. No one would hire someone with a felony conviction for elder abuse to manage money. The consequences of his greed would follow him for the rest of his life. In the 2 weeks between the verdict and sentencing, something interesting happened. Kevin's children, my grandchildren whom I hadn't seen in months, reached out to me. The older one, Michael, called to apologize for believing his father's version of events. He said the trial had opened his eyes to who his father really was, and he was ashamed of how they'd treated me. He asked if he could visit the farm, to see the place his grandmother had loved so much. I told him he was always welcome, that the sins of the father shouldn't be visited on the children. His younger sister, Emma, sent me a letter, a handwritten apology that reminded me so much of Eleanor's careful penmanship that it made my heart ache. The sentencing hearing was packed. Word had spread through the community, and people wanted to see justice done. I gave a victim impact statement, though it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I talked about the betrayal, the pain, not just physical, but emotional. The loss of my son, not to death, but to greed. I also talked about forgiveness, saying that while I couldn't forget what Kevin had done, I hoped that someday he would understand the value of what he'd tried to destroy and feel genuine remorse. I asked the judge to be firm but fair, to give Kevin consequences that would make him think about his actions, but also give him a chance to redeem himself. Sarah also gave a statement, talking about the impact on the family, the division Kevin's actions had caused, the trauma of seeing her grandfather injured by his own son. She was eloquent and composed, but I could see the tears she was fighting back. She ended by saying that the farm would continue, would thrive, and would remain in the family for generations to come, just not Kevin's branch of the family tree. It was a harsh truth, but one that needed to be said. Even Pete Henderson asked to speak, telling the judge about the importance of family farms, about the tradition and heritage Kevin had been willing to destroy for money. He said that in all his years of farming, through droughts and floods and market crashes, He'd never seen anything as devastating as a child turning on their parent for profit. His words carried weight because everyone knew Pete as a man who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. Kevin's statement was brief and felt hollow. He apologized for his actions, said he'd been under stress, that he'd never meant for things to go so far. But there was no real understanding in his words, no recognition of the deeper betrayal he'd committed. He talked about missing his mother, about financial pressures, about feeling like I'd never approved of his choices. It was all excuses, no real accountability. Judge Thornton listened with a neutral expression, but I could see her jaw tighten when Kevin suggested that I bore some responsibility for the conflict by being stubborn about selling. Judge Thornton's sentence was stern but fair. 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months, 5 years of probation after release, mandatory counseling for anger management and gambling addiction, and restitution of $50,000 to cover my medical expenses, legal fees, and pain and suffering. The permanent restraining order would remain in effect for life. Kevin could never come within 500 feet of me or the farm again. She also ordered that he have no contact with me, directly or indirectly, unless I initiated it. As she read the sentence, she looked directly at Kevin and said, "Mr. Blackwood, you assaulted the man who gave you life, who raised you, who provided for you, all because he wouldn't sell his heritage to fund your poor financial decisions. This court hopes that your time in custody will give you opportunity to reflect on what you've lost through your own actions. Not just your freedom, but your family, your heritage, and your father's love." Kevin was taken into custody immediately, and Susan fled the courtroom in tears. I sat there for a moment, feeling the weight of it all, the end of my relationship with my son, the justice that felt more like loss, the future that would go on without him. Sarah took my hand, and we walked out together into the November afternoon. The air was cold but clear, and I could smell winter coming on the wind. Back at the farm, we did what farmers always do. We went back to work. There were animals to feed, equipment to winterize, plans to make for the next season. That evening, I went through Eleanor's lockbox again and found something I'd missed before. A small envelope with my name on it, sealed with wax like she used to do for special occasions. Inside was a short note in her handwriting. "My dear Jed, if you're reading this, then you've had to use what I prepared. I'm sorry for the pain you must be feeling, but proud of you for protecting what we built. The farm isn't just land. It's love made tangible, dreams planted in soil, hope harvested year after year. Kevin lost sight of that, but others will see it. Sarah sees it. Trust in the future, my love. Plant your seeds and watch them grow. All my love, Eleanor." The weeks following the sentencing were quiet but productive. Sarah had officially taken her semester off to work the farm, and we fell into a comfortable routine. She was a quick learner, eager to understand, not just the how, but the why of everything we did. We repaired fences, serviced equipment, planned the next year's crop rotation. She brought new ideas: cover crops to improve soil health, a small greenhouse for year-round vegetable production, a farm Instagram account to document our work and connect with other young farmers. It was strange how natural it felt, working alongside her, like this was always how it was meant to be. The community's response to everything that had happened was overwhelmingly supportive. People who'd barely spoken to me before stopped to chat at the feed store, offering help if I needed it. The church organized a workday at the farm, with dozens of volunteers showing up to help with projects that had been neglected during all the legal drama. They painted the barn, repaired the chicken coop, cleaned out the gutters on the house. It was humbling and heartwarming to see the community rally around the farm, understanding that it represented something larger than just one family's drama. Michael and Emma started visiting regularly, driving down from Kansas City on weekends to help with chores and learn about their heritage. It was awkward at first. They didn't know how to act around me after everything that had happened with their father. But gradually, working side by side in the fields and barn, we found our rhythm. Michael showed a particular interest in the mechanical side of farming, spending hours with me in the machine shed learning to repair and maintain equipment. Emma gravitated toward the animals, especially the chickens, and started a small business selling eggs to neighbors and at the farmer's market. The trust Jennifer had helped establish was finalized, with Sarah as the primary beneficiary contingent on her 5-year commitment to working the farm. But we also added provisions for Michael and Emma, allowing them to earn shares in the farm's ownership through their own commitment and work. It wasn't about blood or birthright. It was about dedication, understanding, and respect for the land. The perpetual agricultural use covenant remained ironclad, ensuring that no matter who inherited the farm, it would remain a farm forever. Winter settled over the land like a blanket, giving us time to plan and prepare for the future. Sarah and I spent long evenings by the fire, going through Eleanor's files, learning about the farm's history, planning improvements and expansions. She was working on her thesis, interviewing me about farming practices, family traditions, and the changes we'd seen over the decades. Her professor had become interested in the project and was talking about turning it into a larger study on the preservation of family farms in America. One snowy evening in January, as we were reviewing seed catalogs and planning the spring planting, Sarah asked me something that had clearly been on her mind for a while. She wanted to know if I regretted what had happened with Kevin, if I wished things had gone differently. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I told her that I regretted that Kevin had become someone capable of violence and greed, regretted that he'd lost his way so completely, but I didn't regret protecting the farm, standing up to him, or ensuring that the land would pass to someone who valued it properly. Eleanor had seen this coming and had prepared me for it, and I'd honored her wisdom and foresight. The Davidson Development Company made one final attempt to acquire the land, this time through a third party who claimed to be interested in agricultural investment. Sarah and I met with them out of curiosity more than anything else, and it was almost comical how quickly their true intentions became clear. When we explained about the perpetual agricultural use covenant and showed them the legal documentation, they realized they'd wasted their time. The representative actually thanked us for being upfront about it, saying he wished all landowners were as clear about restrictions on their property. He also mentioned that Kevin had cost them considerable money in research and preparation for a deal that could never have happened, and they were considering legal action against him for misrepresentation. Spring arrived with its usual mix of hope and hard work. Sarah and I prepared the fields, serviced the equipment, and started planting. She'd convinced me to try some new sustainable farming practices: no-till cultivation in certain fields, integrated pest management, and crop diversification. It was different from how I'd always done things, but I could see the wisdom in it. The land needed to evolve to survive, just like the family running it. We worked from dawn to dusk, our hands in the soil Eleanor had loved, planting seeds for a future she'd envisioned. The local newspaper did a story about the farm, about how it was being preserved for future generations despite family conflict and development pressure. The reporter interviewed Sarah and me, took pictures of us working in the fields, and wrote a piece that captured not just our story but the larger issue of family farm preservation. The article went viral online, shared thousands of times by people who understood the value of agricultural heritage. We received letters and emails from all over the country, from other farmers facing similar pressures, from children estranged from their farming parents, from people who just wanted to express their support. Kevin's children continued to visit and work on the farm, gradually becoming more comfortable with their role in its future. Michael had started talking about changing his major from business to agricultural engineering, wanting to combine modern technology with traditional farming practices. Emma was researching heritage chicken breeds, planning to expand our small egg operation into something more substantial. They never talked about their father, and I didn't ask, but I could see they were building their own relationship with the land, separate from his shadow. One day, in late spring, I received a letter from Kevin. It was forwarded through Jennifer's office, as per the restraining order requirements. I debated whether to open it, eventually deciding I needed to know what he had to say. The letter was short, written in pencil on prison stationery. He said he was in counseling, working through his gambling addiction and anger issues. He said he understood if I never wanted to hear from him again, but he wanted me to know that he was beginning to understand what he'd lost. He didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't make excuses, just said he was sorry and that he hoped the farm would thrive without him. It was the first genuine thing I'd heard from him in years, and while it didn't change anything, it gave me a small measure of peace. Summer brought the best corn crop we'd had in years. The new techniques Sarah had implemented were paying off, and the fields were green and healthy. We hired some local teenagers to help with the work, teaching them about farming while getting the extra hands we needed. One of them, a young man named Tyler, whose family had lost their farm to foreclosure, showed particular promise. He reminded me of myself at that age, eager, hard-working, and in love with the land. Sarah took him under her wing, and I could see her becoming a teacher, passing on knowledge just as Eleanor and I had done. The farmers' market became a regular part of our routine, with Sarah and Emma running a stand every Saturday morning. They sold eggs, vegetables from the greenhouse and garden, and Eleanor's famous jam recipes that Sarah had learned to make. But more than just selling products, they were selling the story of the farm, educating customers about where their food came from and why family farms mattered. People would stop by just to talk, to share their own stories, to connect with something real and rooted in tradition. As summer turned to fall, I could feel the cycle of the seasons in my bones, the same rhythm that had governed my entire life. But now, instead of feeling like an ending, it felt like a continuation. Sarah was planning to make her move to the farm permanent after graduating, and she'd been accepted to a graduate program at the State Agricultural College that she could complete while working the land. Michael and Emma were planning their own futures with the farm in mind, understanding that it was their heritage, even if their father had forfeited his claim to it. The harvest that year was more than just bringing in crops. It was harvesting the fruits of everything Eleanor and I had planted, not just in the soil, but in the family. The farm was secure, legally protected, and in the hands of people who understood its value. The next generation was engaged and committed, bringing new ideas while respecting old wisdom. The community had rallied around us, understanding that preserving one family farm helped preserve them all. And somewhere in prison, perhaps Kevin was finally understanding what he'd traded for the promise of easy money. Standing in the field one evening as the sun set over the corn, painting everything gold like it had the day Eleanor and I were married, I felt her presence strongly. Not in a ghostly way, but in the land itself, in the soil we'd worked together, in the plans we'd made and the protections she'd put in place. She'd known this day would come, had prepared for it, had ensured that the farm would survive even if our son lost his way. Her wisdom lived on in the legal documents that protected the land, and Sarah's commitment to continuing the tradition, in the covenant that would keep developers at bay forever. The farm's story didn't end with Kevin's betrayal. That was just a chapter, a dark one, but not the final one. The story continued with Sarah learning to drive the combine, with Michael rebuilding an old tractor engine, with Emma collecting eggs in the morning mist. It continued with Tyler and the other young people learning that farming was more than just a job. It was a calling, a commitment to feeding the world and stewarding the land. It continued with every seed planted, every harvest brought in, every season that turned the wheel of agricultural life. People often ask me if I regret how things turned out, if I wish I could have found a way to keep Kevin in the family fold while still protecting the farm. The truth is, Kevin removed himself from the family when he chose greed over love, violence over respect, money over heritage. I didn't lose a son the day he hit me with that shovel. I'd lost him years before to the city lights and the promise of easy money. What I gained through this whole ordeal was clarity about what really mattered, who really understood the value of what we'd built, and how to protect it for generations to come. The restraining order means Kevin can never set foot on this land again, can never walk the fields where he played as a child, can never see the sunrise from the porch where his mother used to rock him to sleep. That's his loss, his consequence, the harvest of the seeds he planted with his greed and violence. But the farm doesn't mourn his absence. The corn grows just as tall, the soybeans produce just as well, the cattle graze just as peacefully. The land endures, as it always has, indifferent to human drama, but responsive to those who tend it with love and respect. Sarah has plans for the farm that would make Eleanor proud. She wants to start an educational program, bringing school children out to learn about agriculture. She's talking about adding beehives for honey production and pollination, maybe some fruit trees for a small orchard. She sees the farm not just as a business but as a teaching tool, a living museum of agricultural heritage, a bridge between the past and the future. She understands what Kevin never did, that the true value of the farm can't be measured in dollars but in its ability to sustain life, preserve tradition, and connect people to the land. As I sit here on the porch, watching the fireflies begin their evening dance, just as they have every summer of my life, I feel a deep sense of peace. The farm is safe, protected by law and love, tended by hands that understand its worth. Eleanor's foresight saved not just the land, but the family legacy, even if it had to skip a generation to find worthy inheritors. The harvest of justice may have been bitter in some ways, but it was necessary, clearing away the rot so new growth could flourish. Tomorrow, Sarah and I will be up before dawn, checking the crops, feeding the animals, continuing the endless cycle of farm life. Michael and Emma will drive down for the weekend, eager to help and learn. Tyler will stop by after school to work on the tractor he's been restoring. The neighbors will wave as they drive by, knowing that the Blackwood Creek farm will remain a farm, a testament to the endurance of agricultural tradition in an ever-changing world. And somewhere, in whatever way spirits watch over the living, Eleanor will be smiling, knowing that her careful planning and deep wisdom preserved what she loved most. The story I've shared with you isn't just about family drama or legal battles. It's about the intersection of tradition and change, the value of land beyond its monetary worth, and the importance of protecting what matters from those who would destroy it for profit. It's about the wisdom of the elderly, dismissed too often in our youth-obsessed culture, and the strength that comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for. It's about the next generation, not the one that lost its way, but the one that found its path back to the land. And it's about justice, not the vengeful kind, but the restorative kind, the kind that protects and preserves rather than just punishes. If you've enjoyed this story of triumph over betrayal, of wisdom defeating greed, of a farm saved from development, and a legacy preserved for future generations, I hope you'll share it with others who might need to hear it. There are too many family farms being lost to development, too many elderly parents being exploited by greedy children, too many traditions being sold for quick profit. But there are also people like Sarah, like Jennifer, like Judge Thornton, who understand that some things are worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth preserving for generations yet to come. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in justice served country style, and don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss when karma comes to visit. And remember, age and wisdom beat youth and greed every time, especially when you've got a good lawyer and a grandmother who planned ahead. The sun has set now, and the evening chorus of crickets and tree frogs has begun. The farm is settling into its nighttime rhythm, the cattle bedded down, the chickens roosting, the fields resting under the starlight. This land has seen 4 generations of Blackwoods work its soil, and God willing, it will see many more. Not Kevin's line, that branch has been pruned from the family tree, but Sarah's, Michael's, Emma's, and others who understand that a farm is more than property. It's heritage, it's responsibility, it's love made manifest in crops and livestock and carefully tended soil. The harvest of justice has been reaped, and now we plant for the future, confident that the seeds we sow will grow strong and true, protected by law and love, wisdom and determination, and the ghost of a wise woman who saw it all coming and made sure we were prepared.